So with that, it's a pleasure for me to introduce our speakers for this evening. We have two. They'll be co-presenting this talk. The first, Dr. Bill Finlayson, received his PhD from the University of Toronto and was for more than 25 years the director of the London Museum of Archaeology, now known as the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, and spent many field seasons digging at the late Iroquoian Draper and Keffer sites, along with sites in the Crawford Lake area. In the early 2000s, Dr. Finlayson established the CRM firm This Land Archaeology, which he steered until his retirement 3 years ago. And he has, since 2017, published 4 popular books and 3 academic books through the Our Lands series. Our Lands Speak series. Harry Lerner received his PhD from McGill University and is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Laval University. He divides his research interests in lithic analysis, raw material properties, and useware between sites in Ontario and the US Southwest. And he's also interested in settlement pattern analysis here in Ontario. So with that, please join me in welcoming Drs. Finlayson and Lerner. The title of their talk tonight is The Keffer Site, Extant Data, New Insights, and Fresh Perspectives on the Ontario Woodland Tradition Occupation of the Don and Upper Rouge Rivers, Southern Ontario, Canada. So take it away, Dr. Finlayson.
Thanks. Thank you very much. The Keffer site was a realignment substage Ontario woodland tradition village occupied between about 1525 and 1550. It was located on 2 adjacent properties owned by land developers, and the excavations were funded by those land developers and all 3 levels of government. I would like to note that after the 1988 excavations, I had begun to write a report on the settlement patterns from the Keffer site. Unfortunately, more pressing priorities at the museum in the 1990s required me to set Keffer aside. It was only after 2020 and the completion of my publication on the Draper volume that I could return to Keffer. I then connected with Harry and discovered that he had recreated the settlement pattern data in an AutoCAD file as part of his MA research. It was because of this that we've been able to complete this new volume on Keffer with more than 200 color figures. The Keffer site was one of the first assessment projects in Southern Ontario, which resulted in the assessment by surveying fields and test pitting of 2 adjoining properties totaling 157 hectares. We salvage excavated the Keffer site. We relocated and preserved the Keffer ossuary, and we created a new cemetery for the more than 24 burials that had been recovered from the excavations. These are the personnel that were involved in the Keffer site project under my direction. And I note that Francis did the faunal analysis, and that publication is still one of the most comprehensive studies of a faunal report on the Ontario woodland sites. In 1985, we dug the northern part of the Keffer site, which had been farmed for many years. We discovered a single row of palisades, which encompassed most of the village, and a double row of palisades to the outside. We excavated 18 longhouses and 4 wigwams, 854 squares in 18 middens, and recovered more than 131,000 artifacts. We returned in 1988 and conducted excavations on the southern part of the site, which was largely in a bush lot. We continued the tracing of the palisades around the double row of palisades and found a single row of palisades around house 19. We excavated 640 squares in longhouses and 876 squares in 10 middens. We recovered more than 191,000 artifacts. So in this presentation, I'm going to talk about Keffer site settlement patterns, Harry's going to discuss our work with sweat baths at Keffer. I will then summarize our interpretation on the 28 other Ontario woodland tradition sites, which we have studied on the Don and Upper Rouge rivers, and Harry will summarize our study. There's been a growing trend towards replacing culture history with a framework based on chronological dates that represents a more scientific approach. At the same time, we also need to acknowledge the presence of the original Anishinabek occupants of Southern Ontario and their relationships to the Ontario Iroquoians. We should be using all data to maximize potential insights into the prehistoric past. Accordingly, while incorporating recent data from increasingly refined dating techniques, we retain the use of the established culture historical framework and particularly focus on the Black Creek, Lalonde, and Realignment substages of the late stage of the Ontario woodland tradition. In our study, we're fortunate to have benefit of significant advances in radiocarbon dating based on dates on a single corn and on analytical techniques such as Bayesian modeling of AMS dates. The research of Stuart Manning, Jennifer Birch, and their colleagues have provided significant new dates on Ontario woodland tradition villages in our study area. Most importantly, this research demonstrated the contemporaneity of Draper and Keffer, which significantly informed our research. In our study of Keffer, we defined 5 clusters of houses. House cluster 1 is at the northwestern end of the site, comprised of a number of longhouses and 2 wigwams. House cluster 2 is 2 longhouses and a wigwam. House cluster 3 is on the knoll at the southwestern part of the site. There are 5 longhouses there and 1 wigwam. House cluster 4, 3 longhouses between the single and double row palisades. And house cluster 5, a single house at the southern part of the village. And this just shows the palisade. The single row palisade incorporates about 0.93 hectares. The double palisades to the left includes another 0.71 hectares, and the area around house cluster 5, 0.1 hectare. So we end up with a 1.8 hectare village. Originally, we thought that the single row palisades had been torn down partway during the occupation of the village and had been replaced by the double row palisades. However, our research suggests a different interpretation, which is illustrated in this artist's conception. We now believe that the single and double rows of palisades were built about the same time, and that the single row of palisades was retained as a secondary line of defense against war parties which had breached the outer rows of palisades. In looking at specific aspects of the Keffer site, we had catwalks at the northwest part of the village. There's an entrance here with a large catwalk, and outside it, a single hearth, which we are interpreting as a beacon fire. On the northern part of the village, we found another entrance to the village, and this was between the double rows of palisades. So you entered the village here near the one end of house 4, you walked between the 2 rows of palisades, you came out into the area between the single and double rows of palisades. Then there was another entrance here and is related to what we have interpreted as a visitor's house associated with house 1, which is a chief's house. What is most interesting about this entrance is that there were two infant burials recovered between the 2 rows of palisades. And this has led us to suggest that this entrance was a path, like the central corridors of longhouses were paths, as my McCapchess has suggested, and that the infants were buried along this path with hope that the spirit of the child would re-enter the womb of a passing woman and be reborn. As far as I know, this is a unique feature. One of our tasks in terms of the settlement pattern was to look at the growth of the village, how it changed over time. And we have come up with 3 phases of occupation. We present a construction phase of occupation with 2 houses and a wigwam at the northwest end of the village, and a longhouse, which had been extended 3 times, and a wigwam on the knoll, and an enclosed area within the village. We interpret this as a walled area where people could retreat if the village was attacked while it was under construction. There was an initial phase of occupation, which involved 3 houses here in House Cluster 1, 4 houses in House Cluster 1, 1 house in House Cluster 2, 3 houses in House Cluster 3, 2 in 4, and 1 in 5. In the final phase, we get the addition of 2 new houses. Sorry, we get a rebuilding of 1 longhouse here. We get a shortening of House 7 to allow the construction of House 6. In House Cluster 2, House 10 is added along with a wigwam. On the upper terrace, there are 5 houses total. We get the addition here in House Cluster 4. We get the addition of House 4. And so this is how we perceive the final village. We see the population increasing from 192 individuals to 480 individuals to 744 individuals. During my study of the Keffer site in 1985, I noticed a number of defensive strategies that were used in helping to protect the village, This included the placement of the longest houses on the outer edges of the village and the abutment of some houses against the palisade to create cul-de-sacs in which there was restricted movement, and sometimes the placement of the longest houses parallel to each other to create long, narrow corridors. We see the same thing at Keffer. The longest houses are on the outside of the village. We get the abutment of a house here. Oh, sorry. Okay, hang on. Abutment of a house here and abutment of a house here before it was extended. So this is one of the interesting things that we found based on the contemporaneity of Draper, and it helped us helped us understand Keffer. Now I'm gonna stop sharing and turn that over to Harry.
Okay, so before we get into some of the details regarding our analysis of the sweating structures at Keffer, I wanted to show this slide where we have side-by-side photos on the left of a semi-subterranean sweat lodge from House 5 Crawford Lake and a surface sweat bath from House 15 at Draper. And I want to draw your attention to 3 important distinctions between these 2 types of sweating structures. The first is obviously their appearance as they were preserved archaeologically. They appear quite differently in the archaeological record. The second is the time and energy investment required in the construction of each. Clearly, the semi-subterranean sweat lodge would have required more time and energy to build compared to the surface sweat bath. And thirdly, their placement relative to the longhouse. In the case of the semi-subterranean sweat lodge, it's located outside the wall of House 5 with the entrance accessed from inside, and the sweat bath at Draper is located along the central corridor. And because of these distinctions, while it's commonly accepted practice to refer to any structure associated with sweating as a sweat lodge, we felt it was warranted to make this terminological distinction between sweat lodge and sweat bath. So given that at Keffer, we're dealing almost exclusively with sweat baths, this is the term we use throughout the course of our analysis. Now here is a map of Keffer, and you'll see highlighted in blue all the sweat bath post molds that were recorded along the central corridors of virtually every house at Keffer. You'll also notice that different houses have different numbers of sweat bath post molds. and that in most cases, when we're dealing with groupings of sweatbath postmolds, we're dealing with palimpsests. Clear evidence that these locations along these central corridors were used repeatedly for sweating. And this poses a considerable challenge in trying to understand the patterning and the nature of sweating at Keffer at any site. Now we used as inspiration for our analysis of the sweatbaths at Keffer Alan Tiska's 2015 paper in Ontario Archaeology entitled Huron-Wendat Sweatbaths. And we used his study as a baseline, as a jumping off point for our work. And we strove to expand upon his innovative study and develop his approach further. And we'll see shortly how well we did. Here is a table from our recent Keffer book that itemizes the estimated number of sweatbaths per house at Keffer. We've broken this down to estimates for original structures, extensions, and the combined totals. And you'll notice at the bottom of the table, the bottom right-hand corner of the table, that we've estimated that at Keffer, there was an excess of 1,400 sweatbaths that were built, torn down, rebuilt over the course of Keffer's occupation. Now, these estimates, we followed Tiska's lead from his 2015 paper, where he cited ethnographic estimates of 4 to 5 postmolds per sweatbath and archaeological estimates of between 5 and 7 postmolds per sweatbath. He argued that using 5 posts per sweatbath is a reasonable compromise between these estimates, and we followed Tiska's lead, and this is how we came up with these estimates that you see here. Now, in our sweatbath analysis, to try to make sense out of these palimpsestic postmold groupings, we looked at 3 basic attributes: sweatbath postmold patterning, sweatbath entrance orientation, and sweatbath stability to midline. The last of these involved the introduction of 2 new variables: maximum sweatbath corridor width and the distances from each house end to the midpoint of the nearest sweatbath cluster. And then we compare these 2 variables to see if there's any correlation between them and if they can be used as one way of differentiating between chief's houses and non-chief's houses. Here we've reproduced a couple of figures from Tiska's 2015 paper, and his study of the sweatbaths at the Kahagway site. He identified 6 different patterns of sweatbath postmold, and he did so by first superimposing outlines on the groupings of postmolds, and then looking at the distribution of the postmolds along these outlines, as well as the distribution of the outlines themselves. And on this basis, he identified these 6 patterns. And one of the variables he argued affected these patterns is what he referred to as locational memory. In other words, the familiarity with which those involved in sweating had with a particular location in a given longhouse. And this could reflect the symbolic significance of that location in a given longhouse. It could reflect the experience or expertise level of those involved in sweating, and it could involve the number of people involved in sweating in that particular location and in any combination. As we were doing our study of the sweatbaths at Keffer, we began to realize that what we believe what we were seeing is, rather than distinct patterns of sweatbath postmolds, we were seeing more of a continuum of postmold patterning. And more about that in a second. But first, using House 1 at Keffer as an example, we identified 24 sweatbath outlines. And we provided sort of a close-up of this particularly large concentration of sweatbath postmolds in the center of the house to more clearly display the individual outlines we identified within that grouping of postmolds. And then based on these outlines, we identified 11 sweatbath clusters in House 1. And we did this for every house at Keffer. And these clusters, we defined these based on the individual outlines, such that if two outlines overlapped by 50% or more, we consider them to be part of the same cluster. If they overlapped less than 50%, we consider them to be part of separate clusters. Now, just to briefly revisit these figures from Tiska's paper, again, instead of looking for specific or discrete sweatbath postmold patterns, we believe that what we're seeing at Keffer is more of a continuum of sweatbath postmold patterning that reflects things like varying degrees of locational memory, for example. And what we came up with is this. And these are actual examples of sweatbath outline, sweatbath clusters from Keffer. And what we're seeing here from left to right, one aspect of it is from left to right, increasing locational memory, such that from the left, we're seeing a pretty broad distribution of sweatbath postmolds along the outline, and then moving across to the right, where we see these very tight, concentrated groupings of postmolds at specific locations along each outline. And what we're arguing here is that we're seeing a progression of increasing locational memory as one aspect of this patterning. And in our book, based on this sort of continuum model of postmold patterning, we suggested a number of hypothetical models of sweatbath cluster formation. And I'm just going to show one example this evening. This one, which represents sweatbath cluster formation that shows a consistently high level of locational memory. And here's a sort of quick and dirty animation. You see that over the course of use and reuse of this particular location, we see the maintaining of those discrete groupings of postmold at specific locations around this outline, indicating consistently high level of locational memory. Now, again, locational memory is only one of the possible factors that influences sweatbath postmold patterning. So it's again, these are palimpsestic deposits and very difficult to tease apart, but we're trying to sort of take the first steps towards doing this teasing apart process. The second variable we looked at, sweatbath entrance orientation, what we did was, much along the same lines of identifying the entrance to a longhouse by noting gaps in the postmold at each end of the house, we looked for gaps in the distribution of postmolds around each outline at Keffer. And what we did in AutoCAD is, once we located the inferred entrance, we drew a line connecting the two ends of the outline and calculated its midpoint, as well as the midpoint of each outline, and drew a second line shown here in green. And we did this for every outline at Keffer. We then superimposed a simple compass rose with the 4 cardinal directions onto the entrance midpoint, and then measured the angle counterclockwise from due east to the line connecting the entrance midpoint to the outline midpoint. And here we have examples from house 1 on the left and house 9 on the right at Keffer. And for the example from house 1 at Keffer, we obtained a measurement of 357 degrees, or east-southeast, nearly due east. And the example from house 9, we obtained a measurement of 240 degrees, or south-southwest. And here we have house cluster 1 at Keffer. And you'll notice that houses 1, 6, 7, and 8, where the outlines are all in green, these are all eastward-facing sweatbaths, we believe. Houses 2 and 3, outlined in blue, these are all westward-facing sweatbaths. And given our interpretation that house 21, an Anishinabek wigwam, was expanded to form house 3, which was then replaced by the longer house 2, we suggest that the westward-facing sweatbaths in houses 2 and 3 not only reflect the possibility that houses 2 and 3 were occupied by Anishinabek peoples, but more broadly that there was a significant presence of Anishinabek people at Keffer. Now, the third attribute we looked at with sweatbaths derives from this table from Tiska's 2050 paper, where he compared a number of sweatbath characteristics across a number of sites. And you'll notice that the 3 right-hand columns, these characteristics he dealt with in a very qualitative way. And I want to draw your attention in particular to the stability to midline column here. TISCA recognized three broad categories of stability to midline. Midline meaning the sweat bath post mold were fairly evenly distributed about each house's midline. Y suggests a wider distribution about the midline, and not necessarily as centered on the midline, and scattered represents the most diverse distribution of posts about the midline. Again, not necessarily centered on the midline. So what we set out to do was to try to quantify this variable of stability to midline. And to do this, again in AutoCAD, we superimposed what could be best described as lines of best fit on each house wall. And again, we're using house 1 as an example. Then we drew a line perpendicular between those two lines of best fit and calculated its midpoint to precisely position the midline of each house. Then, for every sweat bath cluster, we took two measurements from the midline to the distalmost sweat bath post mold on each side of the midline. So for each sweat bath cluster, there was two measurements. So we took those two measurements and we took the shorter of those two distances and divided it by the larger of the two distances to come up with a ratio. And this ratio, the closer it is to 1, reflects a more centered sweat bath cluster relative to the midline. And a ratio closer to 0 reflects a more offset sweat bath cluster relative to the midline. So in house 1 here, for example, sweat bath cluster 6 with a ratio of 0.955 reflects that sweat bath cluster 6 is almost perfectly centered on the midline of house 1. Whereas sweat bath cluster 11 with a ratio of 0.556 reflects the fact that it is clearly offset to the east. So it has a lower stability to midline. We took this a step further and we took the two longest measurements for the entire house. We did this for every house at Keffer. And we see here highlighted in a dark green, and use those two longest measurements to define what we call the maximum sweat bath corridor width, here shaded in blue. And for house 1, that maximum sweat bath corridor width is 2.12 meters. And then here, once again, we have house cluster 1 at Keffer. And you'll notice that houses 1 and 7, which we argue were chief's houses, both have maximum sweat bath corridor widths of over 2 meters, whereas houses 2, 3, 6, and 8 all have maximum sweat bath corridor widths of less than 2 meters. So we suggest that maximum sweat bath corridor width may be a useful indicator for differentiating between chief's houses and non-chief's houses, along with other attributes such as wall post densities, numbers of pits in the house, and so on. Now, in addition to looking at the distribution or placement of sweat bath clusters relative to the long axis or midline of each house, we wanted to look at the placement of sweat bath clusters relative to the short axis of each house. Now, we're all familiar with the concept of longitudinal bilateral symmetry of longhouse organization. We wanted to expand upon that a bit and to see if there's any degree of transverse bilateral symmetry about the short axis of each house. And this is where that second new variable, the distance from each house end to the midpoint of the nearest sweat bath cluster, comes into play. And what we found at Keffer is that these distances between houses varied quite a bit, but within each house, these distances were more consistent. Then we calculated mean values for these distances from the house ends to the nearest sweat bath clusters and compared that to the maximum sweat bath corridor width and came up with the scatter plot. And what you'll notice is that the data points in red, which represent the houses we argue were chief's houses, tend to group together or at least group apart from the data points in blue, which we believe represent non-chief's houses. And what we're seeing here is that chief's houses tend to have wider maximum sweat bath corridor widths and shorter distances from the house ends to the nearest sweat bath clusters, whereas non-chief's houses tend to have narrower maximum sweat bath corridor widths and longer distances from the house ends to the nearest sweat bath clusters. And we even found that there was a moderately positive correlation between these two variables. Now I'll pass it back over to Ben.
As our study progressed, we realized that there were data on 28 other Ontario woodland tradition sites on the Don and Upper Rouge rivers, 15 of which had been totally excavated, and that these provided a wealth of comparative information, which would further our understanding of the Keffer site and how it originated. We defined 4 clusters of Black Creek substage sites, 2 on the Upper Rouge and 2 on the east branch of the Don. We also saw a cluster of sites here on the west branch of the Don. All of these sites, except one, was a realignment substage. The exception was a site that was dug by Dana Poulton, comprised of a single longhouse, the Snyder site. And these are the sites that we used and are present in our book. One of the things that we did in our study was to reevaluate extant interpretations. And the best example of this was Murphy Golding and Orion. The southern end of the Murphy Golding site was dug by ASI, as was the Orion site. The northern part of the Murphy Golding site was excavated by my firm, and we did testing up here to make sure that the Orion site didn't extend further. So the net result is that Murphy Golding and Orion are 2 separate sites. They're not a single large site. Jennifer Birch in her PhD thesis suggested that Murphy Golding and Orion were one large site and that they represented an early form of coalescence. That is not the case. In terms of undertaking this study, we produced 2 maps of each site that had been completely excavated. We produced an interpretive map which showed the outline, the extent of excavations, the sites and their extensions, and interior features such as hearths, sweat baths, and burials. And we also looked at the overlapping of houses, and we calculated the number of post moles per meter in house walls and extension walls as it was proposed by Gary Warwick in 1998. Our study of these 28 sites resulted in 6 patterns of settlement. The first pattern of settlement is palisaded villages, which were occupied year-round. Of course, Keffer is the best example. The other example is Watford, which was dug by Bob Pierce for the museum. And at Watford, there are 6 houses in 3 pairs enclosed by a single row palisade. And we now interpret this as a village occupied year-round. Bob suggested it was seasonally occupied. The second pattern was medium-sized unpalisaded settlements occupied on a year-round basis. And Orion site is an excellent example of this with 6 longhouses. There were also small unpalisaded settlements occupied year-round, and we use Murphy Golding in this example. And Murphy Golding we interpret as 3 pairs of houses that were sequentially occupied. So there was these 2 houses here and here, then these 2 houses, these 2. Clearly they can't have been occupied contemporaneously, and then a 3rd pair here. So clearly Murphy Golding is a very complex site. It's not a single site with a single occupation. There was also a single example of a single house by itself occupied year-round. This is the 2 Pine site excavated by Bruce Stewart. Again, our interpretation is that this single house was not occupied seasonally, but was occupied year-round. The next pattern was cabins in cornfields, and the example was Senang, 2 houses side by side, excavated by Keith Powers. And finally, there were special purpose sites. There's this component of the Hope site comprised of 2 houses with a row of palisade poles that we don't understand. And there was the Somme site, a structure of some sort, which again is not clearly understood. So what we did then was look at each of these sites and create a chronology So for instance, we have Murphy Golding 1, Murphy Golding 2, Murphy Golding 3, and Orion. And we looked at the estimated length of time of occupation of these sites based on postmoles per meter and estimated populations. So we get the two sites, clusters of sites on the Upper Rouge and the 2 clusters of sites on the Don, and then Keffer. So in terms of our archaeology of communities, we see that the 4 Black Creek substage communities on the Don and the Upper Rouge were lived in primarily on a year-bound basis without palisades. Sometimes there was a single house, and some of the houses showed Anishinabek wigwams. So it is these 4 communities that we believe amalgamated to create the Keffer site. Now, the other thing I wanted to talk about was coalescence on the frontier. And clearly both Draper and Keffer are coalescent villages as represented by the growing populations and by the increased emphasis on defensive strategies. But what we have found is between Draper and Keffer is there were different processes of coalescence. And at Draper, coalescence involved the creation of a core village and then 2 segments added here, a segment added here, a segment added here, and a final segment here, a segment here, and then a segment here. So Draper was formed by other villages or communities moving in to Draper. Keffer, we see a different pattern from the initial occupation to the final occupation. You get some rebuilding of houses and construction of new houses. But the big thing at Keffer was that there were 12 instances of houses being extended to add more people to the village. So coalescence then is not a simple process, it's a complex process which needs more study. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Harry.
So, just before I summarize the results of our study, I just want to take a moment to discuss the importance of legacy collections and legacy data. We believe that our study demonstrates the more than considerable potential of reevaluating legacy collections and legacy data using newer information and newer analytical techniques to improve our collective understanding of the past. We would even go so far as to say that revisiting legacy collections and legacy data should be the rule rather than the exception in archaeological practice. And this is only underscored by the fact that there is a wealth of collections and data sitting in repositories and archives that remain largely untapped beyond original site reports and initial interpretations. Now, to summarize some of our findings, we argue that the occupational history of Keffer and the surrounding region during the late 15th and early 16th centuries may have been somewhat different than conventionally thought. For example, as Bill just mentioned, Keffer, we argue, was a different kind of coalescent community compared to Draper. Therefore, the process of coalescence was likely a more complex and more variable than previously considered. We also argue that there was a well-developed and well-integrated defensive strategy employed at Keffer and Draper in response to increasing hostilities. We also noted that there was a predominance of sweatbaths at Keffer, and this is also the case at Draper. And in both sites, these represent highly palimpsestic deposits. But despite this nature, they can provide greater insight into everyday village life than has been traditionally thought. We also heard that inferred sweatbath orientation suggests there was a sizable Anishinabek presence at Keffer, demonstrating the significance of the Iroquoian and Anishinabek alliance in the late 15th to early 16th centuries along the central north shore of Lake Ontario. More broadly, the work we've presented here should be seen simply as the next step in an ongoing process of reassessment of our collective knowledge. It's particularly essential to involve First Nation stakeholders in this process, and we very much look forward to working with them moving forward in the hopes of promoting greater mutual cooperation and deeper understanding of their heritage. And on a final note, just a few quick comments about future directions for research. We've already begun a more detailed study of the various strategic defensive initiatives employed at Keffer and Draper in response to growing hostilities. We've also begun a detailed study of the sweatpath clusters at Draper to explore how they evolved, how they compare to those at Keffer, and how they may reflect the different processes of coalescence that formed each settlement. We also argue for a continuing reevaluation of our Keffer settlement pattern analysis, including, for example, further assessment of sweatpath cluster stability to midline based on sweatpath outlines to refine the work we've already done using sweatpath clusters. We also argue for exploring patterns of sweating activity as recorded in the relative frequencies and distributions of sweatbaths versus sweat lodges to better understand the apparent increase in the former and decrease in the latter over time in Southern Ontario. And more broadly, we argue for expanding our overall approach to other watersheds along the North Shore of Lake Ontario and beyond to both further evaluate our approach and to hopefully refine our understanding of the prehistoric past. And here we have images of Bill's Draper volume from 2020 and a recently released Keffer volume and some information about where copies can be obtained for those interested. Thank you.